To begin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where in the world you are watching this class now. Welcome. So we're going to examine a rather obvious question in the story of Avraham. And the question is as follows. We all know the story, how Avraham at the advanced age of 100 years old and Sarah at the advanced age of 90 years old miraculously have a child, Yitzchak. And that was a great miracle, so much so that when Sarah was informed that this would happen, she received that with disbelief and laughter. Is this possible? It did happen. Miracle. And Yitzchak is born. Here's the question. 40 years later, I'm just going to ask you folks not to move your camera because it creates a very, just keep the camera still on the table. So the question is that 40 years later, Avraham marries Keturah. This is Hagar. This is the maidservant that he had sent away years earlier at Sarah's behest. He remarries her, and the Torah says they have 6 children. This is at the age of 140, friends. So the question is, how is it that the Torah doesn't indicate that this was miraculous? It's just recorded almost as matter-of-factly that Avraham remarries Hagar and has 6 children. If the miracle, the birth of Yitzchak was a miracle, and that was 100 years old, how much more so is this? And 6 children, no less, who then sends away to the east. But why does the Torah not indicate that it was a great miracle? A very simple and obvious question. How does the Torah not indicate that it was a great miracle that he had 6 children even later with Hagar? Now, you might want to suggest and say, well, it's really one miracle that endured. At the age of 100, he became rejuvenated and it never left him. It remained. So that 40 years later, when he gave birth to 6 other children, to Hagar, who is called Keturah, it's the same person. Keturah means many things. It means incense, a reference to the sacred service in the temple, indicating that her actions were as pleasing to God like the incense, and other reasons as well why she was called Keturah. At any rate, so you might want to say that was just in parenthesis to explain why I'm referring to Hagar and Keturah. It's the same person. So you might want to say the Torah does not record that it was a miracle because it wasn't. It was just a continuation of the original one with the Yitzchak. However, we cannot say that, because if you read the narrative, the Torah tells us that when Avraham appointed her servant Eliezer, to find a wife for Yitzchak, the Torah prefaces that by, and Avraham was old. So the Torah says later on, 40 years later, Avraham is old, and therefore he's considering now, we must find a wife for Yitzchak to continue the legacy, to continue the family tree. And after that, he marries Hagar and has 6 children. So it seems from the narrative itself that it's not like the first miracle lasted. It didn't. Because the Torah mentions later on, Avraham was old a second time after the story of the birth of Yitzchak 4 decades later, indicating that the miracle no longer, it was a one-time miracle that Yitzchak, he fathered Yitzchak, and that's it. So that begs the question, then it's even a greater miracle that he has 6 children with Keturah. Why does the Torah not indicate this? The Torah acknowledges that he's old, but doesn't say it was a miracle. Question is clear. Yes, very simple, straightforward question. The answer to the above is as follows. When Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak, she said, God has made delight, laughter. All who hear will rejoice with me. Now Rashi says, why would everybody rejoice the fact that Sarah was having a child? It's their personal joy, but why would the rest of the world be rejoicing with her? So Rashi tells us, because that day, many barren women conceived, many people that were sick were healed, many prayers were answered, and there was great laughter and joy and celebration in the world. That came with the birth of Yitzchak. With the birth of Yitzchak, Sarah acknowledges that many are rejoicing with me. Why? You just heard why. Prayers were answered, wombs were opened, the ill were healed, and there was much joy in the world. What do we see? We see, this is from Scripture itself, because Rashi is explaining the simple meaning of the verse, why many people are rejoicing with Sarah, so that the birth of Sarah brings with it rejoicing in the world at large. Moreover, Rashi explains on the words when she describes, Sarah speaking, describing what had happened to her. And she says, Heinika banim Sarah. Sarah has nursed children. Sarah uses the plural. Why is she referring to the plural when she's celebrating, acknowledging, thanking Hashem for the miracle of the birth of her son? Why does she use the plural? Rashi explains she uses the plural because this was later when she weaned Yitzchak. This is not the birth, I'm sorry. This is when she weaned him. Because then, many of the matrons, the princesses, they brought their children and she weaned them. Not only her own child, but many other children. People were saying, Rashi goes on to say, that this wasn't really her son. They brought a foundling from the street. But that she was nursing their own children, the children of others, and they were leaders. Everybody understood and saw that in fact it was her son. Moreover, it's clear that it was her son. It's also clear that Avraham was the father because Yitzchak looked like Avraham. But all to point out, here's what we're stressing now, that with the birth and then the weaning of Yitzchak, it's not just a personal celebration. There's much joy and celebration in the world on the day of his birth. The day that he was weaned, she weaned other children as well. And many. So, the question is this. Why was this necessary? Many children. Even if she nursed one other child, it's clear that she's been rejuvenated and she is in fact the mother. God doesn't do miracles for nothing. So what's the reason that she has to nurse all of them, all of the children that were brought to her? Because, as we're going to explain, integral to the birth of Yitzchak is a world that celebrates, is affecting the world. And that's why that happens with his birth and when he's weaned. We're going to explain this is not simply the personal simcha of Avram and Sarah, of the Jewish people, but it's a celebration that the whole world needs to partake in. And therefore she must nurse many children, not just one, all in fact that brought their children to her. And that's when she weaned Yitzchak, and when she gave birth to him, many prayers were answered and there was great rejoicing in the world. Now, having said that, what have we established now? We have established, and we'll explain why presently, that the birth of Yitzchak must bring with it, and did, a celebration for humanity at large, as we see with Sarah, both the birth and when she completed nursing him. Same is true of Avraham. it stands to reason that just like for Sarah, Yitzchak's birth brought to other miracles in her merit, affecting others, and she brought salvation to the world, it stands to reason the same is true of Abraham. Avraham, that the ness of the birth of Yitzchak to Avraham didn't stop there, but further miracles result. And what is that? And not just miracles for them personally. The point is miracles that affect the world at large. And that is that Avram later fathers 6 children who are sent to the east and become fathers of tribes and nations. Avram affecting the world. More detail about this later. So the difference is Sarah it's immediate and Avram it's 40 years later, and we'll explain the reason why. But what we've established now is, we've answered our question. Why doesn't the Torah say that there was a miracle that when Avraham remarries Hagar, Keturah, and has 6 children, that that's not another miracle? The answer is, it is indeed the continuation of the first. Why? Because we see the first is not just personal, but affects humanity. It was so for Sarah, it was so for Abraham. Later, not immediately, but in effect, he remarries and has children, populating the world, and in the end, bringing his teachings to the world. He sends them to the Far East. More about this later. So, the Torah doesn't have to say that that is another miracle. That's the continuation of the miracle of the birth of Yitzchak, because Yitzchak's birth is bound up with affecting the world. We see it by Sarah, and it's also true of Avram, but later. Not immediately, but later. We have to explain why now. Why is the birth of Yitzchak, why must it be bound up? Why must the whole world celebrate? Why must it affect the whole world? And also you have to understand the difference between Sarah's effect and Avraham. As you just heard the story, Sarah affects the world just because she herself underwent rejuvenation, and she gave birth and she nursed. So therefore, as a consequence, without her doing anything, the day that Yitzchak is born, remember that story, the day he's born, prayers are answered, barren women conceive, the sick heal. She's not doing anything. It comes naturally. Because of the miracle that happens to her, she gives birth to Yitzchak without having to engage directly the world. These miracles happen. Blessings come to the whole world. Later too, when she weans Yitzchak, so she's nursing a child. She's nursing a child, okay, another child. But it isn't another distinct, separate act that she does. It's her state brings naturally the blessing to the world. Avraham has to actually go and do something. He remarries. It's not so immediate. It's not cause and effect. He's got to engage. He remarries. And that's why it happens years later. Because it isn't like Sarah. She's blessed. Everybody else is blessed automatically, naturally. Avraham is not that way. He's blessed. Now you go and do something and share it. So he remarries Hagar, this virtuous, wonderful woman. And they have 6 children. He sends them to the east. And this is all part of populating the world. But it's something Avraham has to do. Friends, as we always say here, the difference between men and women, which we'll explore deeper now on a cosmic level, is women are, men do. This is exactly what's being conveyed here. Sarah's rejuvenated. Sarah gives birth. Naturally, there's celebration and miracles in the world. Sarah's nursing. She naturally nurses his other. She is. It's her state that brings all this blessing. Avram's got to go out and do something. Find Hagar, remarry her, and have children. So men do, men perform, women are. Now, we're going to understand this very beautifully and exquisitely in terms of the coming of Mashiach, the Messianic era, and our role in bringing that about. Let's explain. The first thing we have to explain is the fundamental question: why is Yitzchak's birth Why must it be bound up with the rest of the world? Indirectly by Sarah, just by being, engaging through Avraham. Either way, what we're saying now is that his birth has to bring, and did bring, an effect on the nations of the world, the whole world, all of humanity. Question is why? And the answer is, Yitzchak is the first, he's the first Jew born to a Jewish father and a Jewish mother. It's really with him that the Jewish people start. And the point is, that the whole world was created, as Rashi tells us, the whole world. Rashi points out the opening word, of course, we're all familiar with this teaching. The opening word of the Torah is the word Bereshis. It's an unusual word, Bereshis, without going into the grammatical construct of it. It's a very strange term. We would have expected the Torah used other grammatical construct. Simply Elikim, Bara, Reshis, or Bara So'ela. Anyway, Bereshis, Rashi says, is hinting to two beginnings. Bereshis. Who are two beginnings? The Jewish people and the Torah. So the world was created for these two things. Meaning to say, it's integral. It works both ways. It's a symbiotic relationship. The world cannot exist, cannot reach its perfection without the Torah and the Jewish people as the ones who carry the torch, the light unto the nations. And it also means that the Jewish people and the Torah, its whole mission is to illuminate the world. That's integral to the soul coming down to the world, is to illuminate the world. So Yitzchak's the first Jew born to Avraham and Sarah. His birth, factored into his birth, part and parcel of his birth at the very, very outset, must be an effect on the world. It's the mission statement right there. This isn't a personal simcha. I mean, what a wonderful teaching, friends, we're sharing here. The Jew cannot be satisfied with the personal simcha. It's my family, my community, my religion, my people. Every joy he celebrates, and if you look at our praise and look at the way the celebration is, it's always about illuminating the world, bringing healing, transforming darkness into light. And of course, we're driven that way, friends. It's in our DNA, whether we're aware of this consciously or not, whether we learned about this in Cheder or not, that's our mission, to be a light unto the nations. It's in our DNA. And Jews are just driven to fix the world. And we feel guilty about the world. And the world demands, the world accuses us of every ill. There's a distortion it's a truth, distorted. It's because, yes, the Jewish people, our whole role is to fix the world and bring Mashiach, and we're the central cog. And it's just part of our DNA. We've got to fix every problem. Political, medical, health, psychology, everything. Jews are the forefront. In groundbreaking ways. So that's why Yitzchak was the first Jew. It's got to start with his birth, and then when he's weaned, his conclusion of his nursing period, next stage in his growth, it's all got to be bound up with the whole world celebrating. But there are two ways. There's Sarah's way of affecting the world, and Abraham. Let's explore. Let's explore further this whole notion of our effect in the world. It's actually our mandate to affect the world. This is codified in the code of Jewish law, the supreme code of Jewish law, the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah. Let me read to you what he says in chapter 8 in his final book. Hope you're with me, folks. Okay. So I want you to pay attention closely, because we're going to examine his words here and the division of his words into the various paragraphs. 2 paragraphs, in fact. So here's the salient quote. Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded by God to influence, compel, but it doesn't mean with a sword, it means compelling arguments. All the inhabitants of the world to accept the commandments given to Noah's descendants. These are the 7 Noahide laws. And Hashem commanded Moshe and us, communicated to Moshe, that it's our obligation as Jews to inspire, influence the world to observe the 7 Noahide laws. That's law number 10. In law number 11, he adds, anyone, referring to a non-Jew, who accepts upon him or herself the fulfillment of these 7 mitzvot and is precise in their observance, is considered one of the pious among the Gentiles. Chasidei mechasidei umot haolam, or chasidei umas ha'olam. The Rambam continues, this applies only when he or she accepts them and fulfills them, because the Holy One, blessed be, commanded them in the Torah and informed us of them through Moshe, our teacher, and told us that Noah's descendants had been commanded to fulfill these laws. However, if the non-Jew fulfills them out of intellectual conviction alone, that it's a beautiful lifestyle and he likes the philosophy and the ideology, but not because Hashem commanded it at Sinai, so says the Rambam, such a person is not considered pious amongst the Gentiles, nor of their wise people. So 2 things are said here. And he divides them into 2 separate laws. What are the 2 separate laws? He says that when it comes to compelling argument, that's law number 10. And that is, he simply makes the statement that they should, our job is to see to that they keep the 7 Noahide laws. In the next halach, he said, to do that properly, the Gentile must accept it, not because of their rational theological arguments, in the sense that they make sense, but theological arguments, yes, in the sense that they were commanded by God at Sinai. But that is a separate law. It's a new numbered law. Why didn't you just combine the 2? Why didn't you just simply say, it's our obligation to influence the world to keep the 7 Noahide laws, and a non-Jew observes it because God commanded it at Sinai, not just out of, it makes sense personally to him, is considered pious and so on. Just one law. So it seems from here, the fact that we can deduce from this that the 2 separate laws is that they're 2 separate things. Our job is to convince them intellectually of the value. Only then does the Rambam speak about like an aggressive role as teachers. That the non-Jew accepts it because it was given at Sinai, that's his decision. As long as our job is done if he's keeping the 7 Noahide laws. But in the next law he adds a separate thing. If the non-Jew accepts it because he's embracing Torah at Sinai, then he or she is considered a pious one of the Gentiles. So that's already something that's happening to the non-Jew of himself through their volition, perhaps inspired by our persuasive arguments and example and inspiration. But the point being, when have we discharged our obligation to influence? If a non-Jew says, I like these laws, they're the basis of morality and they're beautiful, and we all know the 7 Noahide laws, we've discussed them many times. So the non-Jew is doing it, we've done your job. The next law is kind of addressed to the non-Jew himself. If you do it, however, this additional dimension, because it's commanded of God at Sinai, that makes you a righteous Gentile, that's a whole new level. But that isn't something that is clear that we need to see it happens. It's something that will happen, as we'll see. It will happen really of itself in stage 2. That's why he divides them into two laws. One is what we have to do. He doesn't mention you have to do this in the second law, law number 11. He just says that a non-Jew keeps it because it's commanded by God at Sinai. That's a righteous Gentile. But does not say that we have to see that the person reaches that conviction themselves. That's something that will come of their own accord. So we're seeing already that there's two dimensions in the influence, direct and indirect. Clear so far? Let's explore further. We also see this in the description of the Messianic era, the description of Mashiach. What are we talking about? Just to give you a heads up where we're going with all of this. We said earlier, men do, women are. So we're talking about two kinds of influence on the nations of the world. An aggressive male influence, a female influence. That influences just by being in her aura, without having to engage or debate. That's where we're going here. We see this already, we just observed this subtle distinction when the Rambam talks about our obligation to see to it that non-Jews keep the 7 Noahide laws. He has two laws there, one about things we have to do, and he describes what they will be, or what their optimum is, omitting to say that we need to create that, because that should happen by itself. And that's the higher effect that comes later, in a sense. But let's see now, so that was a model. We were talking now about the 7 Noahide laws, now applying the same principle to the Messianic era altogether, the perfect world. We will see two descriptions, and we'll note the difference. He describes, in chapter 11 now, the final laws of the Rambam, he describes how to identify Mashiach. There's two stages within that. Just to read it quickly, we discussed this in the past, over the years. So, here's the description. If a person will arise from the house, a king, a descendant of King David, from the royal house of David, who diligently contemplates the Torah and observes its mitzvahs as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, as did David, his ancestor, such a person, this great scholar, compels all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah and rectifies the breaches in its observance and fights the wars of God, we may with assurance consider him Mashiach. Consider, we're not certain yet. Then, if he succeeds in the above, in other words, he draws all Jews back to Judaism, he mends the breaches in Jewish observance. If he succeeds in the above, he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he's definitely the Mashiach. He will then improve the entire world, motivating all nations to serve God together, as the prophet Zephaniah states. God says, the prophet speaks in his name, I will transform the people to a purer language so that they will all call upon the name of God and serve him with one consent, with one purpose. In this halacha, we're describing what Mashiach does. This is performance, this is doing. Wages war, fixes, mends breaches, inspires, transforms. It's all proactive. Maybe aggressive is not the right term, but I mean aggressive in the virtuous sense. That's one way, right? Now the second description, the final description in the end of chapter 12. Listen to me, the Rambam described the Messianic era. Mashiach has come already. Here's a description of the Messianic era itself. In that era, there will be neither famine, nor war, envy, nor competition. For good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God, or to know God alone. Therefore, the Jewish people will be great sages and know the hidden matters, grasping the knowledge of their Creator according to the full extent of human potential. As the verse declares, Isaiah the prophet, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the ocean bed. notice here, he's not talking about our influence directly. Notice the subtle description. The Jewish people, great sages, know the hidden matters, grasping the knowledge of their Creator according to the full extent of human potential, and the world is filled with the knowledge of God. The occupation of the entire world will be to know God alone. Now this is describing not a situation where we are teaching, we are inspiring this, it's happening. It happens naturally. The distinction. So the end of chapter 11 is Mashiach's what he's fixing. He's waging wars. He's battling assimilation, battling ignorance, battling lack of observance. He's battling the integrity of the land of Israel, that we shouldn't compromise it in Jewish safety, in Jewish lives. The wars. That's what he described in the end of chapter 11. But then, the Messianic year itself, the effect on the world is natural. No need to engage. You be. And the rest of the world is inspired by that alone and basks in your union with God. Having said all of this, so we'll understand the difference between Avraham and Sarah. That Yitzchak's birth has to be bound up with the universal, global celebration. Now we understand why. That's the mission of the Jew. The mission of the Jew, not for himself or herself, is to bring godliness and healing and sanctity to the whole world. What we're learning today is that there's two stages or two ways. There's the Avram way and there's the Sarah way. There's the male way and there's the female way. Both their names had to be changed before Yitzchak was born. Listen to this. It's an incredible insight. The simple meaning for the name change was, because when you change your name, you change the mazel. So God says, Avram, Sarai, the original names, they can't have children. But Avraham and Sarah, they can. That's a simple reason for the changing of the name. It changed their mazel, their natural conduit to the divine. It's a new conduit, and now the blessing comes for children. But the Rebbe explains, it also must be that the name that they're changed to, the new meaning, has a connection to the birth of Yitzchak. And let's look at it. And we'll see. Avram means Av, the father of Naraim, of one place. Aram Naraim. He was the leader, the prince there. The recognized leader. He was a born leader. Avram means actually also Avram, exalted father. But of whom? Aram. There's those two letters there. Naraim. That was the place. Avraham with the Hey, the new letter, means, it stands for Av Hamon Goyim, a father of a multitude of nations. So from the particular to the universal. One locale, universal. And this, his name's got to be changed to a universal name before Yitzchak is born. Sarai, same thing. Sarai means my princess. Sarah means the princess of everyone. Again, going from the particular, the familial, the tribal, to the universal. And that's integral. When the name is changed, Yitzchak can be born, because now the great mission of the Jewish people can begin in the two ways of Avram and Sarah. The male way and the feminine way. So the male way we described above, when, for example, in our interaction with the non-Jews, discussion, proving, compelling, that's the male way. But then the next law that Rambam says, the next stage of the Gentile truly becoming righteous, of the righteous, the Rambam is not stressing our involvement there. That must come by itself. Why? Because he's inspired by who you are. That's the feminine. First inspired by your words, your teachings, yeah. But the next one by who you are, and that's not a debate or discussion. In other words, by who you are is igniting something within the other. Touched by the depth of your own soul, the non-Jew soul is also ignited, and then will naturally want to become pious and have a relationship with God and not just live these laws because they make sense. But that's not going to be through a discussion. That's going to be soul to soul. That's Sarah. That's Sarah. Likewise, the Messianic era, 2 stages. Fighting God's wars, that's the Avraham effect. The whole world naturally basking in the knowledge of God, that's the Sarah effect, the ultimate. So that's why when Yitzchak is born, the miracles, that the effect in the world is different for each one of them, reflecting their own contribution. For Sarah, it's just a natural thing. People are just caught up in this and blessed, and heavens open up, and when she's rejuvenated, she naturally nurses. She's not doing anything special. She's just being her, and people are attracted to this. Avraham has to go and get married and then father children and send them away. He's got it's performance. It's doing. It doesn't happen right away either. It happens 40 years later, because this kind of engagement doesn't happen naturally, and therefore this resistance takes time. So that's answered our questions, friends. The incredible insight here. So let's review what we learned this morning. Let's review. The basic question was, I'm going to raise the eyes. I apologize that there's 2 cameras in. I'm used to watching this one because it's a Zoom right now and people are watching. There's another camera that's for another. So I have to remember to look this. I'll look there too. So, summary. Our basic question was, why does the Torah not acknowledge that it was a miracle of Avraham to remarry and father 6 children 40 years after the birth of Yitzchak? The answer to that is, the Torah doesn't have to say that because we would expect it. Why? Since we were told that Sarah's birth affected the world, Sarah giving birth to Yitzchak, and moreover, nursing Yitzchak affects the world, and not just a few, but many. All the people that, when she weaned Yitzchak, all the people that had children, nursing children, brought them to her, and she nursed them all, without exception. We don't know the numbers, but it could have been great numbers. And when Yitzchak was born 2 years earlier, there was great rejoicing in the whole world. Prayers were answered, the sick were healed. So since we are told, this is all derived from the verses, the plural in the verses, and the verse says, Sarah says, great rejoicing in the world. So the verse is telling us that this was a universal celebration. So since it happened for Sarah, the reader knows it must have happened for Avraham too. He must have also brought rejoicing to the world. So when you read later that he remarries, has 6 children, that's what it is. He fathers new nations, sends them to the east, populates the world. And they, by the way, brought the seeds. Distorted for a millennium, true. But the seeds for monotheism brought to the east, corrupted, but transformable. As I'm seeing, that's not the story. So, bottom line, he's affecting the world too. So we're not surprised. The Torah doesn't have to say there was another miracle, because that's all part of the package of Yitzchak being born. Yitzchak's birth has to affect the world. Why, we went on to explain, that's the mission of the Jew. And he's the first Jew born to a Jewish, actually the firstborn Jew. Avraham became Jewish. Yitzchak is born Jewish from his father and his mother. Primarily his mother. She determines that. So, that answered our original question. Then we went on to explain, we have to understand, all right, that's the mission statement, affect the world. But we note there's a big difference between Sarah's effect and Abraham's effect. Sarah's effect is natural just by being, and Avraham is by doing, by creating, by giving birth, by remarrying. And it was a whole dramatic event. The answer is yes, there's 2 ways to affect the world, or 2 stages. There's the direct engagement, and then ultimately your example. That doesn't require engagement, and that inspires deeper. And that comes from the recipient spontaneously, or through their own volition and choice, their own desire. Another way to phrase that is, guys make peace by defeating the enemy. The feminine talent to make peace is by transforming the enemy into an ally. Not because I won the argument, but because you've embraced it. You feel the truth. That's the Sarah way. That's feminine. That's being. So that we then observe the two components in our mandate to inspire the Gentiles to keep the seven Noahide laws. There's the Avraham mandate and the Sarah mandate. The Avraham mandate is get out there and teach. Engage in discussion and inspire and invite and convince. That's the Avraham male way. The next stage is the Sarah way, the final stage. Not only are they convinced of the arguments, the logic of the seven Noahide laws, but the soul of it, the spirit, because God gave it at Sinai. See, the first law is to convince people that to live by the seven Noahide laws is the only way for society to function. It'll disintegrate. And that's not difficult to explain. They're all basic laws of civil governance and respect. But that doesn't make a person a righteous Gentile. It's if the righteous Gentile embraces because God commanded at Sinai. That the Rambam puts in a separate law doesn't say we have to work on that, because that should happen in and of itself. That's the Sarah effect. That's if you are a Jew as you should be, and you are expressing soulfulness and sanctity, that person's going to want to be part of it. And this is much deeper than any debate or any discussion. That's why it's a separate law. Law number 12 of chapter 8. And it doesn't say you've got to engage in it, because it isn't about engagement, it's about being. And likewise, we saw a similar parallel Mashiach. Stage 1 of the Messianic era is about winning wars, spiritual wars, even physical wars. Fighting for the survival of the Jewish people, the integrity of the land of Israel, the safety of our people. That's a physical war. And then the mitzvahs, campaigns, and that's a spiritual war, assimilation. But that's stage 1. Stage 2, the Rambam describes a world that's occupied in the study of Torah, not because we're telling anybody to. It's the Jew as being the Jew the way he should be, fully and soulfully. The whole world is a part of that, in the most joyous, embracing way. The whole world's pursuing the knowledge of God. That's their pursuit. It's their choice. And as the verse says, one of the beautiful prophecies, the Messianic year, I'll read the words to you, it'll be in the end of days. This is from Chayei. That God's house will be established on the top of the mountains, and all of the nations of the world will stream there. Stream, naturally flow. And many nations will go and they will say, let us go up. Let us go up. We're not being told to come. We want to go to the mountain of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, and we will go in his ways and his pathways. That's the ultimate. And again, that's the second stage. That's Sarah. And that's what happened when Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak. Without having to do anything, go, engage, she was, and the whole world celebrated with her birth. So as we stand now, friends, at the precipice and the very edge of the Messianic era, so it's really both stages. We need both elements. There's got to be go out there and do. We have to use all the resources of the world to spread godliness, the internet, and so on. Social media, go out there and do. But ultimately, the greatest effect, that's the Avraham effect, that's the male effect, that's the weekday, fix, do, tinker. But then Shabbos is being. Shabbos is feminine, Shabbos is the queen, Shabbos is the bride, not the groom, and not the prince or the king. It's queen, bride, Kala. The ultimate effect we have is being ourselves in the truly deepest way. Living soulful lives, not just having convincing arguments about the morality of Judaism or ourselves. Let me rephrase that. It's when our own Judaism is suffused with sanctity and holiness, which means it isn't. I don't do it simply because it makes sense to me and it's beautiful it's so has so many beautiful answers and so deep and so philosophical. No, I connect to. That's a male thing. I connect because it is holiness. It is. Not its message, it is. That's the feminine dimension. That's the Shekhinah. So that's what we're holding today. We're holding today, it's both, but primarily the big chiddush, the big novel thrust today is be Jewish. Connect to the soulful dimension. Know God for who He is, beyond divine intelligence, beyond divine design, the mystery, the holiness of it all. Live that, embrace that, and the whole world naturally wants to be part of that. And that requires no debate at all, because that's simply the truth of Hashem Himself. That's beyond all rationale, all reason, logic, and nature, but suffuses and embraces nature. That's where we are today. On the threshold of the Messianic era, may we merit its complete realization and fulfillment without delay. All right, friends. I don't know if this was recording or not. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So Sarah's bracha was that she was basically rejuvenated. It says like she was 20, which is why her whole system and everything was back to being young. And so my question is, did her bracha only affect the women, or did it affect both the women and the men?
Oh, everybody, the whole world, yeah.
Because if that's the case, so then Avraham also was the same. He was rejuvenated.
It affected the men, that the people who were sick got healed in that sense.
Okay.
Because
the Torah goes on to say that Avraham, before he died, like at 175, he was old, both in physical and like appearance as well. Like, so it's like he wasn't young.
He wasn't.
So when he was having kids at his later ages, he really looked his age. It says he looked his age.
He looked his age, but
exactly.
But we just answered. Why doesn't the Torah point out the miracle? Because it's the miracle of Yitzchak's birth that just on delay and happens later. But it's really the same birth, and it had to be because it's all about affecting the world around us. Yeah. Okay, folks. Have a wonderful week.
You too.
And let's share good news. Thanks for joining.